Hello and welcome to Take Me Back, the interviews. This is the 19th episode, and this is a show where it's another platform, like the Take Me Back book is a platform, the column in the Valley Reporter is a platform, to gather the stories of local folks who really have the ability to take us back and talk about what this town was like. Because what it was like informs what it is like today. Lots of people stop me on the street, and they're just so appreciative that we're doing this. We are going to archive all this information as well for future generations. Today, I have to say, I'm probably the most excited that I have been in this process because I have someone here who is uniquely positioned to talk about many different roles in the Valley, from growing up on a farm to learning how to ski at Mad River Glen when his dad was working there, to going into the ski industry. Well, I'll let him tell his parts of the story that he chooses. But really, I became very close with his wife, Alice Rogers, as educators. We got similarly enthused by certain projects and worked together. And Randy was in the math department when I was teaching. He was, in fact, my boss. He was the head of the math department, as was Alice, my boss. But through the years, through different projects, we've become close friends. And for Randy and me, a lot of that has to do with collaborating on writing. This book would not be what it was without Randall Graves, and I thank you wholeheartedly.
Oh, shucks.
And welcome to Take Me Back, the 19th episode.
You are tenacious.
You betcha. You got to tell the thing we do, this dance we do about writing.
Oh, the dance is that I write and I share it with Kathy, and generally not even Alice, my wife. And I share it with you, and Kathy props me up and says, "This is great and this is wonderful. Can I share it with other people?" And I immediately go, "No." Like my French bosses.
This is true. He says
my
no.
French bosses at Rossignol, their first answer was no. So I always say no, and now I know that there's going to be this pause with you. And eventually I'll write back an email or a text and go, okay, what'd you think of that? And fast forward, now Kathy has, how many pieces do you have in here? 3 or 4?
4. There's 4 of yours in there.
There's 4?
Yeah.
And as Kathy knows, I have diligently and happily written many like stories. They're from my childhood, mostly. I only have 1 or 2 that are present day. And those don't seem to have, in my mind, the same. My niece wrote me yesterday about asking me to write a book on ski racing in
Amy
Vermont.
or a different niece?
Oh, a different niece, Tara. And Karen's oldest daughter.
Nice.
And she said she has a son at Cochrane's. And she said, you know, you have your poetic way of writing.
You do.
And actually, I hadn't heard it put in those terms. But eventually I come back to you and go, well, here are things. How do you, and I'm very self-conscious about that because unlike a math equation, it's kind of either right or wrong.
Right.
But I also did, as you know, teach expository writing. And I read voluminously, and that's not hyperbole. Typical this morning, I have the leisure in the morning of reading New York, and not in full. I have on, electronic, New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Vermont Digger, 7 Days.
I do the same.
A periodical from Maine, Portland Press,
Yeah.
Bangor Daily News. I'm sure I'm leaving one out there, and then I always have 2 books going at the same time. Right now, I have my beach reads, the beach reads, and I have a new and always a piece of history usually, and I have a new biography of Joshua Chamberlain that just came out in October, of course, of Gettysburg fame, but he was a professor at Bowdoin College, and then went on to the Battle of Gettysburg and Little Round Top. So I read and I...
Well, as long as we're here in this subject of the dance we do,
Yeah,
because it
it's
really
true, it is.
It's hilarious. I pretend I didn't hear the no. That's the key. He says, no. In the beginning, well, I'm about to read you.
And sometimes it's a no, and sometimes it's just crickets.
Yeah, and then I don't hear from him. But I know if I just give him the room in 2 weeks or 3 weeks or whatever, it's going to come back. And I always love you, Randy. But let's do it. Let's go to the page 32 in the book. Now, those of you that have it, you're aware that there's a thread of journal entries that are memoir of me. It's all true. Everything happened. What it was like to try and get the column going, trying to get people to talk to me. As Randy said, I mean, we live in a culture where locals, by and large, we're not raised to be show-offs, right? So there's this sort of reticence. I mean, I see it in my own husband. Like, it's a big joke that he wouldn't let me interview him for a year and a half. So we're going to go back to the first impression with Randy. He sent me an email with this beautiful story. You rode your bike to school. It was the last day of school.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, terrific. I don't even have to do any work here. I'm just going to lift this. And he said, no. Oh, no. I'm much too private a person. So, journal entry, September 2021. Do you remember the friend I was telling you about who sent me fantastic stories but wouldn't let me print them? That's Randy Graves. He's married to my dear friend Alice Rogers. He's kind of a modern-day Renaissance man. I've witnessed him do everything from mend a fence to solve a complex geometry problem and write great stories. Stories I coveted for this book. It's much easier to find information about the highlights of the Mad River Valley, such as the opening of Mad River and the other ski areas, than it is to know what the historic families were experiencing. When I refer to the historic families, I mean families of native Vermonters, families that have lived in the valley for many decades. Many settled here for a century or two, and they so loved the land, they figured out ways to adapt and prosper. Randy grew up on Spring Hill Farm. If I have a random research question like, what year did the state of Vermont change from cans to bulk milk storage? He's the guy. While I can interview members of other historic families, there's nothing like a real writer like him to paint the picture. Randy has a clear memory of the day he realized his quiet farm town was changing, and he finally agreed to let me publish that memory.
Was it like pulling teeth?
Very much so. But ignore the no.
Yeah, that's...
So I've asked Randy, because this is such a treat for me to know other writers, to appreciate their work. I said to him, I'm going to embarrass him wholeheartedly, I guess, in this episode, but the story he's about to read to me is my favorite. And I don't mean just my favorite in this book. It is probably my favorite story of all time. So
Well,
I'm going to ask
Thank you, Kathy.
him. I've never
humbled.
heard you read this work out loud, so please.
I didn't do any practicing for this. And there is no doubt that my voice is going to shake because it is personal. So just to preface, as you know, and I'm proud of this, my sisters do our family history, and I'm a seventh generation Vermonter three ways.
That's amazing.
And I have in my office, when I write, I often look up at my great-great-grandfather's discharge papers from the Civil War. And I surround myself with the things that I like, my fly tying flies and pictures of baseball and pictures of skiing. And I found that I don't write well if I'm not there. So I don't know if that's just me.
You know, it occurred to me the other day. So my Thomas is a 7th generation Vermonter, and Jonathan Mehuron came in 1776. That's 2.5 centuries. It almost knocked me over. I kept putting it in the calculator because
Yeah.
it can't be right. When did your family come? Who was the first?
Well, it depends on which side. My mother's side of the family is, they're Granville in Rochester,
Yeah.
and they've been there forever. And on my father's side, of course, you have grandmothers and grandfather's sides. My father's mother's side is St. Johnsbury. There's actually a park up in St. Johnsbury that is named after my great uncle up there because he was an integral part of the Underground Railroad.
Oh, wow.
And when his house was demolished, they found the secret hiding place for the slaves on their way to Canada. So the Ramseys, and there are some scattered around in these cemeteries here,
Yeah.
are that side. My father's mother spoke French in the household. There's French Canadian in there. To answer your question directly, we have a letter that my Aunt Bev from Warren gave us a copy of that establishes pretty definite roots in 1756 here in the valley.
I have not, this is the first time I've heard him read his own work.
I
so-
try, well, I only do to my wife, only. So this is the second time. So I will also preface, too many prefaces here, guys, sorry. This is a true story. And this, as all my stories and anecdotes go, it mulls around in my head and it runs around, and I eventually write it down. And I have not written all of them down, and but I'm in the process, thanks to Kathy. So this is Dad, Who's That? At some point during my earliest years of grade school, probably when I was still in one of the first floor classrooms in the old Waitsfield High School, our family car was a 1959 black Chevy Impala. We all loved that car, especially my father. It was a classic of the times, a huge, heavy, overbuilt, multi-thousand-pound, Detroit-made behemoth of American steel and chrome and rubber. What we probably loved most about it were the completely non-functional but ever so Eisenhower-esque enormous tail fins, so prominent on most U.S. car brands of that time. A time when Americans in America wanted to forget about the Great Depression and the horrible and tragic years of the Second World War. Most people, it seems, very literally wished to put all of that in their rear view mirrors. Those so-called halcyon years of the 1950s were meant as one big reset for the country well before anyone knew about reset buttons. It was the decade when Ike pushed Congress to fund and build the interstate or defense highway system, a highway system based in large part on the Autobahns he got to know so well and appreciated during the long European campaigns of World War II. Veterans, both men and women, wanted nothing more than to come home and enjoy life, enjoy peace, enjoy family, enjoy economic stability, enjoy prosperity, and enjoy freedom. For many Americans, driving represented a certain freedom of choice. So as I said, our family loved that car for what it represented and for the adventures it offered on our weekly Sunday afternoon drives. We, meaning my mother and sisters, all completely understood that the family car was really nothing more than a house of worship on wheels to my father, and I suspect a lot of other folks at that time. The family car represented much. Getting in the car and going for a ride was, first and foremost, fun. A certain adventure in the making, but above all else, it was also in a very real way patriotic. We knew we were doing our part, so to speak. Getting on with life we Americans were meant to have. We had pets, dogs and cats, and they were considered part of the family, but honestly, I don't think the family car at that time was far behind. Our Impala wasn't new, nor the black 1955 Impala before it, nor the green 1965 Chevy Biscayne that came after. We never had a garage at that time, and very few in town did. The front dooryard served as the parking lot for farm tractors and the family car alike. Yet Dad endeavored to keep the car washed and polished and vacuumed out. It was a challenge when living on miles of dirt roads. With 3 young children, a small working dairy farm, a newly built and still unfinished house, owning a new family car was well beyond what one would consider to be a luxury. A new car for us at that time was an impossibility, in fact. Even then, my parents needed a car loan. I only learned later in my own life how little cash on hand that my parents had, and many other families in town. My parents at that time lived mostly paycheck to paycheck for many years. And the farm paycheck, aka the weekly milk check, was not necessarily a given each week. Cows could and did die. They stepped in woodchuck holes and they got hit by lightning. They got udder infections, mastitis, which could make the entire load of milk not pass inspection, only to be literally poured down the drain at the creamery. Result? No milk check that week. Think about that. Yes, we had a number of other vehicles on the farm. Dad had inherited from his father an old stake body 2-ton truck for hauling hay, sawdust, and grain. We were, very proudly, a Massey Ferguson tractor family purchased with a bank loan from Palmer Gaylord. Caring for and maintaining those farm tools was more than simply a chore. It was essential. When they broke down, they needed fixing, or we simply did not eat. While I never once recall that ever happening, as kids we knew the cupboard was sort of bare when we had bacon, eggs, and fried potatoes for dinner. We thought that was a treat. Looking back on all of this, I have always felt that the family car, and this one in particular, meant more to us than we never ever realized at the time. When we all got into that car, the rest of life paused, just for a while. Particularly so for my mom and dad, I suspect. I came to understand that my parents had loans not only for the family car, but on the house, the farm, the vehicles, as well as much of the farm machinery. It's not until you're an adult that the impact and weight of that reality really sinks in. My parents frequently comment on how understanding and generous Elmer Mehuron was about milk checks and extending credit to farm families for groceries. Turns out we generally always owed Elmer Mehuron for groceries. I recall times when the power bill had to go unpaid because, as kids, we would overhear that conversation between my mother and father after supper. They, still at the dinner table, and while we were in bed, asleep, air quotes. Much later in life, and well into his 80s, Dad once lamented to me that at one point during that time, that he couldn't walk down Main Street without seeing somebody he owed money to. Needless to say, that continued to weigh on him in many decades later. That was just one part of our world on a small dairy farm before skiing became mainstream in this valley. Above all else, in my mind, skiing brought money. So it was on that expansive front bench seat in our black 1959 Chevy Impala next to my father that a very young farm kid first realized that his hometown was changing. I never turned down an opportunity to go for a ride in the car with my dad. What kid turns down that opportunity? Often it was to get a part at Palmer Gaylord's for the tractor or mower or hay rake. Or maybe, hope upon hope, we'd stop and get a cold Coke. The ones that came in the thick, pale green bottle. There was a Coke machine right next to Palmer's in front of Bonnett's garage. I think they cost a dime. Insert the coin, push down on the chrome lever, and then you had 6 ounces of cold, sugary, fizzy bliss on a hot summer day. Plus, in any event, riding in the car meant not working on barn chores. Off we went. I still recall the next scene as if yesterday, and I have repeated this little story to many friends. At that time, as you came through the covered bridge, the road was still dirt, and in order on the left, the houses were Frank Lovett's barbershop, the house where the Bisbee family lived, and Bisbee's Hardware. Attached, then Mehuron's store, and then the Seabright Pharmacy in the basement of the old apartment building. On the right-hand side was our longtime town clerk, Emily Eaton's white and tidy clapboard house, and then at the corner, the yellow brick building, which at the time was not only the Jocelyn Memorial Library upstairs, if you entered on the Route 100 side, but on the other side was the U.S. Post Office. Clayton Kingsbury was the postmaster, and eventually below on the basement floor was the new branch of the Howard Bank. What I recall this day, though, was that I saw a man walking on the sidewalk, and I did not recognize or know him. I asked Dad, "Who's that?" Dad replied, "Don't know. Never seen him before. Must be from away." Huh? From away? From away? You mean somebody actually walking right in Waitsfield in the middle of the day, and my father did not know this person? My father knew everybody, right? How could that be, and what did that mean? Yeah, it's a funny story, and an old story, and maybe you think it's weird that an 8 or 9-year-old would recall such a seemingly innocuous and mundane happenstance such as that. Completely trivial and commonplace today, but not then and not to me. But it did happen, and I've retold this story many times over. For me, it became and remains a place marker in time and in my childhood. I think we all have those moments in our lives when we know somehow that things have changed. The cosmos shifted. You know, those somewhat enigmatic before and after moments. Those moments can be big or small. They can be weddings, deaths, birthday parties, proms, graduations, or a World Series game. But at that moment in time in my life, I knew the world was bigger than our front yard, and that there were people who came to my town who were from away. Little did I know that this would very soon become the norm rather than the exception. From the complete security of the family car, looking out of that enormous windshield, a little boy lost in that enormous front seat, proudly riding to town with his dad, caught a quick glimpse of the future and what was to come, for better or for worse.
Gets me every time.
Every time.
Every time. And, you know, we mentioned it on the show before, but the photograph that's used on the background, that was Elmer and Aurelia Mehuron's store. And the little boy riding that tricycle is my husband, Tom, when he was 3. So I've got the visual of the block that you paint, including this building. And then you just did it. You've captured a pivotal moment in time. It was you that you're writing about, but many people must have felt the same way.
Oh, of course they did. And I'll also say that if you turn and look at that picture, that above balcony, yeah. I can remember going there for Tom's birthday party, and would always have these great birthday parties, and his mom and dad would be there, and it was, it seemed like it was huge, but I'm sure if you asked Tom that it was probably no more than, half a dozen, 10 friends. And
right.
I can remember that as distinctly as going downstairs, to his grandfather's store. But you're right, it was, and one of the cautions and one of my reservations about these types of stories, and my reservation of always say silently or more vociferously no to Kathy about sharing this, is that I don't want anybody to think that I alone, experienced these. It was everybody in town. I remember once at a meeting and listening to who at that point was an older person in town and saying quite unapologetically, nobody had money. We all were poor. We just didn't know it. But and the phrase was nobody had money, and again that generation, it was on the cusp. The days of the Great Depression were still very real, and the realities of those days they lived with still, and those lessons. So I only reflected on that. One of my favorite stories that I don't know if I've shared it with you is my mother's button box and rag drawer, and that's the title of it. And Mom and Dad saved everything, and it drove my sisters and me crazy, right? In fact, when my dad passed away, cleaning out, and upstairs over his little garage were 42 tires. Why? Because you just didn't throw anything away. You never knew. His saying, and their saying was, well, you don't know.
Well, that was a Depression era mindset, but maybe more so here, because you really were pretty isolated.
From what I was told, I remember my grandfather, my dad's father, but never having a conversation with him. But Aunt Bev, Aunt Barb, Aunt Bev Mobus, and Dad and Uncle Brad and Uncle Ron Graves said that they were never hungry during the Depression. They were on a farm.
Yeah.
But he mentioned going to get flour, and flour was something that you had to pay for. It wasn't, milk or...
Yeah.
And that they used that judiciously, the flour. But I think that those lessons from the Great Depression were valuable. There aren't so much lessons of austerity, as they are frugal, and it always rings in the back of my head. And when I was on the select board, when we went to spend money, money is tax money. It's from the taxpayers. We're not spending my money. We're spending. There's a difference between want and need. And if my dad said that once, he said it 1,000,000 times.
Yeah. I'm curious. I don't know why this popped in my head, but a holiday at your home, what would the meal be on Christmas or?
It's funny you say that. I always ask my sisters this. As Kathy knows, I also endeavored to be a classically trained chef, and I enjoy the kitchen, and I think I know that it stems from, I had a little stool, and before I could do big boy and girl chores like my sisters did, I helped in the kitchen. So I had a little stool, and I helped mother stir and do those things. So I love that. And there is something very real about the connection with your family and friends and food and meals.
Absolutely.
There's just that connection, which is another whole topic. It was said, and it's in one of my stories, that my mother was a good cook, but it was basics. It was my father in that time were meat and potatoes. So daily meals were pork chops. I mean, a baked potato was every meal. If we didn't have a baked potato, my dad would go, "Where's the baked potato?" It was baked potato and some vegetables my mom canned, and all the string beans and all that stuff was downstairs in mason jars. But we had what I would say normal American Norman Rockwell holiday dinners. We had a turkey at Thanksgiving, stuffing in the bird, bells always, green beans, baked potatoes, baked sweet potatoes, and my mom made great pies, always an apple pie, because we had a small orchard. We had 11 or 12 different kinds of apple trees that my grandfather had planted. And Christmas was a turkey as well.
Did you grow the turkeys?
No. We had, my great uncle Shinny had chickens. So different of the farms around the valley. And that's another story. What's in a number?
Yeah. It's one of the stories
yes,
that's
it is.
in Take Me Back.
All the farms, you kind of did what you were good at. Uncle Shinny had chickens and eggs. We never did. We never had poultry. I found once a bag of poultry feed, upstairs in the barn. And Dad said he raised them for a while, but he just didn't like raising chickens, so we didn't. But he would take, I don't know if viewers know, but there were canneries over in Waterbury, and we would pick green beans down where Trombley's, I'm going to make you do homework on that, where Trombley's fields are. We'd pick green beans, and they would go over there. My dad had large fields of potatoes that were raised for selling, and those potatoes would be taken over there as well. So we had downstairs in the root cellar, and it was a dirt floored cellar. We had bushel baskets, the old wicker baskets of potatoes, apples, squashes, and in the sort, and it was great food. We never ever went hungry, but you knew that. And again, going shopping was Friday night. Going to the city.
The city.
You have this great one, those great pictures of
city.
Harry's, and going to the city was Montpelier.
Yeah.
Going shopping was Mehuron's. And so grocery shopping, and I can remember my dad pulling out a $20 bill and going, this is it for the week. This is what we have. And for meals.
Let me ask you a question. I've been looking for the right moment to discuss this possibility with you.
Ooh.
And we're doing it in front of a camera.
Is this a curveball?
No, it's you know my son Bruce very well. Bruce now,
Yeah.
for the audience who doesn't know him, he's the owner of Mehurons. He's the fourth generation to own Mehurons. And he is very attached to the valley and is concerned about harnessing all the history. So he said to me more than once, I will write you a big check to start this. This is how important it is to him. And I say, I don't know. What he wants to do is mark the historic farms. It means the world to him. He's willing to fundraise and work with the towns so those markers can never be moved. I don't know how we can do it. It's something I'll eventually try to tackle. But how do you feel about that? Because he's worried the changes that are coming are going to erase the memories.
Anybody that knows me knows that, especially if you ask me a math problem, I will stare blankly and go, I need a paper and a pencil and come back to it. So I need to come back to that.
Yeah.
I don't find anything. I mean, what bad is there about that endeavor?
Nothing.
Nothing. Nothing. Right?
I'm throwing this at you, but I've had months to think about it.
Sure. There's nothing. I mean, so there's an answer.
Yeah.
How to do it? I mean, please read in here. Towards the end, when my dad was pretty old, I live in East Warren, the People's Republic of East Warren, and I asked him to go from Rupert Blair's farm, and Rupert Blair was one of my dad's best friends, in Bob Gove, and so we drove from Rupert Blair's all the way in the back roads, all the way to Waitsville Common and Spring Hill, and we counted the farms. And you'll have to read the story to see how many of those that my dad picked out.
You can reach out to me. I'll sell you a book.
There were a lot. And I think it's obvious. Most people farmed. Ask your husband.
Yeah.
I mean, Elmer Mehuron was the grocer. Clayt Kingsbury was the postmaster. Otherwise, to make ends, and that's another story, make ends meet, you farmed. I mean, and that carried over from, 2 centuries. It's a hard scrabble, post-glacial, nothing easy about it. And I think that one of the biggest misconceptions is this romantic notion of farming being and I can't remember the name of the artist of the pitchfork and
Oh,
and I
there's a picture of Tony and Donna Egan.
yes, exactly.
Yeah,
So
doing that.
It's GD hard. Dad didn't have days off. There's no day off on the farm. The cows need milking twice a day.
Yeah.
And that's why for me, I live in East Warren, it's actually comforting for me, and I'm not kidding about this. When I hear the DeFriest farm in their trucks, it's comforting noise. When I hear them planting or harvesting corn, it's very comforting to me because it takes me back to growing up when the same sounds were in our own pasture. Mm-hmm. So how do you do that? Bless Bruce for that endeavor. It's going to be difficult. There are some towns in Vermont, in my work on the Planning Commission for many years in Warren, there are some towns in the Vermont that prohibit the scavenging of old stone foundations. Mm-hmm. I know that a place in Waitsfield just did that recently, which is kind of a bummer because they took the foundation from the old farm. It happens. It's their property. They can do what they want with it. So what Dad was able to do, of course, he could remember being at those farms. What I remember about being in other farms was that each farm was different. Like Malin Jameson, who sold his farm to Werner and Erica von Trapp, in their milk stable, they had this big tank of water that came in from their spring, and Malin always had 2 or 3 trout in there that he would catch, and they were swimming around. And you'd walk into their milking parlor, and there was, and Harold Stafford had, just something uniquely different with his, and Uncle Shinny had chickens running around. In the Rivers farm, way up by Virginia Houston's was. And we didn't get up there that much, but it was each barn was unique because it was built for them. Right. So to say it's a wonderful project is, trite, and that'll deserve a lot of discussion and planning.
A lot.
Yeah.
I know. There's so much to do. So much to do. And we need volunteers, by the way. There's a perfect moment.
It's a perfect
moment. Warren and Faceton. Oh, I'm losing my microphone here. Do not have any volunteers for the Historic Society. They have artifacts. They don't have anybody. So please call the town clerks. And Waitsfield, we're actively in Waitsfield working on growing the membership and finding officers. Lois here has held it together for years now, and really some people have to step up, and I'm reaching out. So that's a perfect moment to plug that. You have another written piece that I have not seen. Would you like to read it?
Which one? I brought several.
I say you pick.
Well, my wife Alice often reminds me correctly that not everybody did or can grow up on a farm. Because I frequently say, well, this is how I grew up, and she'll caution me. And it was just unique, and it has become nothing but more so, especially in Vermont. I am heartbroken. And I understand why the number of farms are down to less than 100 in Vermont. It's one of my favorite bumper stickers is no farms, no food. So we're going in the wrong way in that regard with an increasing population. So I don't know the answer to that. And the reason I went on that bit of a tangent is that growing up on a farm, you're with your mother and your father all the time. How wonderful. How unbelievably wonderful. And I'm just reading that biography of Joshua Chamberlain on a farm with his mother and father. She was music and gave in poetry. His father are more of a Calvinist, and encouraged him not to go to West Point, but to go to a seminary and a theology school, which he did. So both my sisters and I have strong influences. Isn't that correct to say from your parents? I mean, doesn't
Sure,
everybody?
absolutely.
If you're lucky to have good parents, which I did, they weren't perfect. We had ups and downs and troubles. But they were wonderful. So I found myself going back and forth, not by design necessarily, but the story about mom and the story about dad. And so how about if I do one with mom, since I just talked about sitting on that big car seat?
I would love that.
Okay. So this one is called Come, Walk With Me. My mother, like my father, were children of the Great Depression, both born in 1919. So in keeping with her times and to the very best of my knowledge, my mother never made any sort of apologies and certainly expressed no regrets for what she willingly considered her primary job during a certain portion of her life, being a mother. She was our mother, and she was incredibly wonderful at her job. There were, for that generation of women, other titles, I suppose, such as housewife, homemaker, you know the stereotype of that age. The image so thoroughly epitomized by the Betty Crocker-esque branding of post-World War II white rural Americana. Those same titles and assumed maternal duties, all mostly eschewed in today's America, and for good reasons. Still, for me, mother was a verb as well as a title. A gerund, if you will. While I never asked her specifically, I very much doubt she ever once viewed raising her children as a job. To be clear, my mother had rules, for sure. And the rules of the house were her rules, and those rules applied to my two older sisters, to me, and to my dad as well, when you opened the wooden screen door and stepped into my mother's kitchen. And when your feet touched the green linoleum floor, all rules applied. At the same time, she was not strict or a disciplinarian, or a strict disciplinarian as I recall it, but we all knew that she had eyes in the back of her head with 20/20 vision. And we all knew that most, but not all of her rules had sort of a buffer zone, like, for instance, picking up my room. We'd all get the initial warning to clean up your room, or go to bed, do your homework, finish the supper dishes. I had this particular habit of leaving my treasured comic books lying about just where I would finish reading them, dropped on my pillow, the sofa, on the floor next to my bed. The warning was customarily issued just once. Yankee frugality. No reason to repeat herself. After that, if the warning wasn't heeded or well taken care of, then consequences were swift. My comic books would come up missing. A numbered Batman or Superman or Avengers or Sergeant Rock would be relocated to my mother's twilight zone of a confiscation penitentiary, and synchronously placing myself in a self-created penalty purgatory. Then came the real consequences, which were equally swift and clear-cut. My mother did not have get-out-of-jail-free cards to be played, but those are stories for another time. I often find myself revisiting my childhood. For me, it is a pleasant journey to meander back to the time of missing front teeth and saying your prayers at night. It's a path, really, that we can all take back, if only for a few minutes. So then, come walk with me. It's probably true for most adults that we look back on our childhood memories selectively and with 2400 hindsight. We forget about the comic books that never reappeared, or times when we were sent to bed earlier than usual for forgetting certain chores after a reminder or reminders. There is, though, a childhood memory that my sisters and I have shared and relived innumerable times over our adult lives, particularly since our mother's passing. Our mother loved long walks in the woods. These shared summer treks, sojourns, I expect, from her daily house chores, very often came after long and wonderful sessions where she would push us in our swings. A summer afternoon on a farm could not be more perfect to recall. To a child, they were endless and free, and without a single care in the world, all as it should be to a child. We had a big maple and elm trees in our front yard and along the road. And if you know anything about trees and all, and you should, you'd know that maple trees are good for syrup and for climbing. They have great lower branches, which, if you grew up in a rural setting, were just begging for an old tire swing. We had 2 swings, actually, one tire and one with a wooden seat. It seems, thinking back, that Mother would spend hours with us in the summer months, pushing us on those swings, all the while with us squealing and laughing and demanding higher, higher with each push. And as she stood there in her housecoat and thrust us up towards the clouds, she would always, invariably, recite for us from A Child's Garden of Verses by Robert Louis Stevenson, her very favorite. The swing. How do you like to go up in a swing, up in the air so blue? All by heart, from the heart, time and again. Her favorite time with us, though, was pretty quiet by comparison to the adventuresome heights and happy sounds of the swings. On special days, she would want to walk and take us along. Our dairy farm had several large meadows, mostly surrounded by woods. She would take us by the hand, until we eventually protested being too old for hand-holding and say, "Come, walk with me." And off we'd go. "Come, walk with me." I imagine there were legions, millions even, of those small rust-colored ants who hated my mother in her walks for one simple reason. She had this habit, while on her walks, of turning over stones of various sizes in the meadows. She'd have us gather round and then stoop over and slowly turn over a rock and tell us to watch all the ants, and sometimes a salamander or 2 go scurrying for cover. Then, oh so carefully, she'd place the rock back in its place. Eventually, during each summer, we grew to know certain rocks in the field, until inevitably Dad plowed the field the following spring for corn or alfalfa. We and she never tired of that routine. The ants and salamanders did, however. When we got to the woodline and entered the cool shades and shadows of the forest, rotting down trees and branches and logs were turned also, looking for creatures for her to identify and name for us. In the spring, we'd take longer walks, and she'd teach us all to identify and name a myriad of wildflowers: Dutchman's breeches, wild addertongues, violets, stink pots, aka nosebleeds, and the rare lady's slipper, and more. I am fortunate, and I am thankful. My childhood was a gift. Our shared childhood was wonderful. Growing up on a farm was one daily adventure after the other, punctuated by chores and, inevitably, a few hard times. We had troubles, bad fortunes, and sad life experiences like every family, but I much prefer to remember those times when my mother took us by the hand and showed us the wild things just outside the kitchen door. She taught us literally to stop and smell the flowers along the way. All of those things which made us laugh together and ask questions. A life of good memories. Memories always easily revisited, just like a walk in a meadow on a warm and sunny summer afternoon. Come, walk with me.
That's beautiful. Just beautiful.
That's my favorite one.
It's beautiful. Well, I'm going to shift gears here because I'm thinking about the most often cited, I suppose is the word, article that I published in the Valley Reporter is about the series about Vermont accent. And it's funny. So I figured we could finish this episode. But we've already discussed how good Randy is at saying no to me. So, and my thing is just ignore him and give him time. So I'm giving you till May to consider coming back on and doing another show. And we can, we can go wherever we want with the time.
Well, of course I'm going to say no. Don't have time.
He has to. It's just the
But we'll be back here in the
tradition.
spring.
But I want to talk about the last piece of yours in the book, which is, I'm looking for your glossary. It's on page 188. So my kids, all three of my sons and my husband are just like Randy. They can fall into the Vermont accent
Yep.
easily, and then I try to do it, and they all laugh at me because it's a particular ear. But like Fred Messer wants a copy of your whole glossary, right? If there's any more, he wants to know.
You mean he hasn't bought a book yet?
Have you, Fred? I
Yeah,
hope
it's
you
right
have.
there.
But he did. He wondered if there were more. So, as part of the Vermont accent, there were 4 articles. Randy actually wrote down expressions that are very particular to Vermont.
I think they are.
Yeah, I think
think
you're
they are.
right. So I don't know. You can read them. You can just say them. You can talk about them.
I have my favorites. I will say, just this week, Alice looked at me and went, "What?" Because, and I'm usually pretty articulate these days. You know, I put the seat down. I've been well trained. But I said, "Go into the RUM room," and that's a hard one for me to. I still have that instead of room.
Yeah.
That one's so much harder for me to say than room. So, and again, if I do linguistics, Vermontisms 101 is first, take all monosyllable words and turn them into at least 2. And take all 2-syllable or 3-syllable words and turn them into 1. Pretty simple, right?
So pick a couple examples.
Garage. Grage.
Garage.
Yeah, garage. Hard G. Garage. And that's a funny one because literally, growing up, few people had garages because they cost extra money. So you parked your car in the dooryard. And I said dooryard, one of my head chefs when Bruce was in his former job
Right.
is from Chicago. And I said dooryard, and he looked at me like I had 3 heads. And I said, and it's pretty easy. Do you know what a barnyard is? Most people can conjure that up, having not.
Sure.
The dooryard ain't that. It's
Which door?
and again, most everybody comes in the kitchen door, right? In houses. What about your house?
Yeah.
Yeah.
In the side.
Yeah,
side
it's a side door. Yeah.
Yeah.
So garage, dooryard, and I think that those are cute and are 2 very common Vermontisms. And I'm looking down here, and I guess you start with Vermont. You know, we're fortunate enough to spend a lot of time in Maine, and I kind of draw the parallel, and I've run this by some generational lobster families, lobstermen and women, and they're very much the same. They're generational, and you didn't see, or today, Vermont farmers, dairy farmers driving around in Mercedes. No offense to Mercedes, none. I'm not poking fun here, and you don't see many lobstermen driving around in them either. The work is never done. You don't get holidays.
Right.
The cows always need milking, and if you set a trap, you are bound to go and check it. So Mainers have their own, and I have trouble with some of them understanding. But the top one here, so when I was doing this list, what goes in the top? Well, Vermont. It's
The very first.
The very first. Just say it as one syllable as you possibly can.
And I'm reading what's next to it, which is interesting. The 14th state and its own republic before it became a state.
Isn't that great?
Well, you wrote this, but I didn't get an understanding of it until recently. That this was a sovereign nation for 14 years. We'll be talking more about that
Awesome.
in the future.
So I don't know what happens in grade school now, but grade school, Mrs. Howard, first grade, Mrs. Barton, Mrs. Pickett, and then Mrs. Stafford. We had Vermont history. That was, I assume if there were standards at that time, which I assume there were, reading, writing, and arithmetic, that you had to take Vermont history. And of course, I grew up knowing that. Now, fast forward decades, my mother-in-law gave me 2 Republic of Vermont coins
Right.
that I have at home. It truly was its own independent republic. Ethan Allen, I have on my outdoor refrigerator the flag of this Republic of Vermont. It's this green with stars, blue stars and a green background. So you could certainly extrapolate and hypothesize that that's where the independence comes from in Vermont. And I think it can easily be true. Kenny Perot once told me that she's such a wonderful person, and when I get in a quandary about politics and the environment, I always rely upon both she and Richard. But she told me once that when she was our legislator, she told me something that really resonates still with me. She said, Vermonters are a very giving lot until you demand it of them.
Oh, interesting.
And it's completely interesting. You can use the words taciturn and, curmudgeonly and grumpy. And I really push back on that. I am just the antithesis of TikTok and taking pictures of myself. Why do you want, I just don't, it's so foreign to me
Right.
to think that you want to see what I had for lunch or my face. It's just, I don't understand it. And I assume that's from here.
Yeah.
That is from it. Now, I will translate and say, I always wanted to be independent. You gave me the best compliment I could have had in this forward. I have been called a Renaissance person, and I've always wanted to be that in my life. Always. Mm-hmm. It's the reason I spent 13 years training in a kitchen when I didn't need to be at an age that was, people looked at me a little bit crazy. I endeavored to be really good at math and science because it was hard. It's kind of the JFK thing, right?
It's the intellectual exercise.
Why do we do something? Because it's hard. My mom and dad going, and I will admit here that they couldn't go to college. My mom did a year and a half at U of M. Mm-hmm. Extraordinary for that time, for this woman from Granville, Vermont, to be able to do that. My grandfather, my dad's father, is a graduate of VTC, of the agricultural school at the time. But Great Depression changed lives. I mean, it's not just 2 years or 3 years, whatever it is you see in the history books. That's a generation. Peter Jennings is right, the greatest generation. And it changed them. And it made us, meaning Vermonters, kind of tuck a shoulder into the wind and go, what today? Snowing, big deal. I got a warm jacket.
Yeah.
It's no big deal. And the words seem inadequate. Persevere, shoulder it, resilient. I don't see Vermonters as curmudgeonly or angry. I see them as, when somebody says, please be honest with me, I know they don't mean it. I know that you need to dial it back. Because being honest with somebody these days, they're not prepared for, generally speaking. I kind of went off on a tangent, sorry.
That's interesting because my son Jonathan, he lives in Hollywood. He's a director. He misses Vermont so much. And the reason is, he says, when he was growing up in this town, that when someone told you something, you may not agree, but you knew where they stood. There's something about our culture that is very honest.
It's honest. It is. And again, it is also, sorry about that if I hit the microphone.
Mine's still on, I hope.
It makes one question about what is being lost culturally. And I made reference earlier when we started about there's a difference to me between, and I've written this to you, culture and heritage.
Yes.
There's a vast difference in history. So I often, when I am pondering how to respond to you or what was going to transpire today, what did you want as an interviewer? Did you want history? Mm-hmm. Did you want comments of culture? or did we want to speak about Take Me Back? There are nuances there that are really important and really interesting, and I can bore you with forever, as you know, over a coffee or some of Tom's nice red wines.
All right, you know what? I think we're going to call it. We've already mentioned please volunteer and how to do that. And I just want to say what a delight it was to have you back. And I will see you in May.
Okay.
I'll be after him. It'll be no for a while, but we'll get around to it.
That was fun, wasn't it?
It was a lot of fun. Thank you so much for watching episode 19 of Take Me Back. And Randy, thanks for taking us back.
You're very welcome.